In June 1944, the Pacific War reached a critical moment. The United States was moving across the Central Pacific, seizing islands one by one in a strategy known as island hopping. The next major target was the Mariana Islands, a group of islands that included Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were vital because they were within range of the Japanese home islands. From these locations, American bombers could strike Japan directly for the first time. The Japanese understood the importance of the Marianas. They fortified the islands with thousands of soldiers, heavy guns, and airfields. They believed these defenses would delay or even stop the American advance. They assumed that even if the U.S. managed to take an island, it would take weeks to make an airfield operational again. That time would give Japan the chance to launch counterattacks and prepare for the next stage of the war. On June 15th, U.S. Marines and Army troops landed on Saipan under heavy fire. Fighting was fierce from the start. The beaches were narrow, mined, and covered by Japanese artillery. As the battle raged, another group came ashore right behind the infantry. These men were not soldiers in the usual sense. They were the U.S. Navy construction battalions, better known as the Seabees. Their mission was simple but urgent: build a combat airstrip as fast as possible so American planes could land and support the troops. The Seabees had trained for this task. They brought bulldozers, graders, cranes, and trucks on specialized landing ships. Everything they needed was preloaded and organized before the invasion began. As soon as they hit the beach, they started clearing wreckage, hauling supplies, and marking the ground for construction. They worked while shells exploded nearby and Japanese snipers targeted them from hidden positions. There was no pause or delay. Every minute counted. The site chosen for the new airstrip was an area of rough coral and volcanic rock. First, the Seabees cleared away brush and debris with bulldozers. They then leveled the ground, pushing coral and earth into low spots to create a flat surface. Once the base was ready, they began laying pierced steel planking, or PSP. These were steel mats with holes in them, designed to fit together quickly like a puzzle. PSP allowed a stable runway to be built on almost any surface. Crews worked in shifts, fitting the panels into place, locking them together, and anchoring them to the ground. While the work continued, Japanese forces did everything they could to stop it. Artillery rounds landed near the site. At night, enemy planes dropped bombs, hoping to hit equipment or supplies. Snipers harassed workers from the surrounding hills. The Seabees did not stop. When a bulldozer was destroyed by enemy fire, another was brought forward and put to work. If a crane broke down, repair crews fixed it on the spot. The pace of construction was relentless. There were no breaks except to grab a quick meal or refill a canteen. Spotters called out warnings of incoming fire while others kept building. By the next morning, after barely 24 hours of nonstop work, the first section of the runway was ready. The timing was critical. American pilots had been circling offshore, waiting for a place to land. As soon as the Seabees finished, fighters and bombers touched down, one after another. These planes went straight into action, bombing Japanese positions and providing close air support for the troops still fighting inland. The sight of aircraft landing on an island that had been under Japanese control only a day before shocked both sides. For the Americans, it was a powerful morale boost. Marines cheered as they saw planes roar overhead, knowing that air support would now be available at all hours. For the Seabees, there was pride and exhaustion. Many were covered in mud, sweat, and soot. Some had worked through the night without sleep. They had accomplished their mission under fire and in record time. For the Japanese defenders, the news was devastating. Scouts reported that the Americans had a fully operational airstrip and that aircraft were already striking Japanese positions. Commanders realized their plans had been broken. They had expected to hold out for weeks, but now their defenses were exposed to constant air attack. This rapid construction changed the battle immediately. Japanese forces could no longer move freely during the day. Their supply routes were cut off. Attempts to bring in reinforcements failed as American planes destroyed incoming ships and barges. The speed of the Seabees' work became a critical advantage. In earlier battles, it might have taken weeks to rebuild a damaged airfield. During that time, the enemy could regroup or counterattack. On Saipan, there was no such delay. The Americans moved forward without pause, using the new airstrip to maintain pressure on the defenders. As the campaign continued, the pattern repeated on other islands. At Tinian, Seabees built even larger airstrips, some capable of handling B-29 bombers. These massive runways were completed in record time, again under hostile conditions. The Japanese never fully recovered from the shock of how quickly the Americans could land planes and extend their reach deeper into the Pacific. The work of the Seabees during these operations was as vital as any combat unit. Without their speed and skill, the island-hopping strategy might have stalled. Instead, they made it possible for the U.S. to move closer to Japan at a pace the enemy could not match. The construction of a combat-ready airstrip in just 24 hours was more than an engineering feat. It was a turning point in the Pacific War, achieved through planning, courage, and relentless effort. The success of the Seabees on Saipan and other Pacific islands was not the result of luck or chance. It was the product of careful planning, specialized tools, and a system built for speed. Before the first Marine hit the beach, the Navy had already set the stage for rapid construction. The Seabees were trained to move like a combat unit, but their weapons were machines. Bulldozers, graders, cranes, and trucks. These were not left behind to be brought later. They were loaded onto landing ships along with men, fuel, and supplies, so they could roll onto the beach the moment the area was secure enough to work. Each piece of equipment had a specific role. Bulldozers cleared trees, brush, and wreckage. Graders leveled the surface and shaped drainage ditches to keep the runway from flooding. Cranes lifted heavy loads like fuel tanks, steel matting, and large generators. Trucks carried tools, fuel drums, and personnel between the shoreline and the worksite. This meant that when construction began, there were no delays waiting for parts or vehicles. Everything was within reach. The material used to build the runways was another key factor. In earlier wars, a runway required weeks of hauling gravel, laying concrete, and waiting for it to set. That was impossible in combat zones where every hour mattered. To solve this problem, the Navy used pierced steel planking, known to every Seabee simply as PSP. These were heavy steel sheets, each about 10 feet long, with rows of holes punched through them to reduce weight. The planks were designed to lock together quickly and form a solid surface strong enough to handle fighter planes, bombers, and heavy transport aircraft. When a new airstrip was needed, pallets of PSP were brought ashore right after the bulldozers. Teams of workers spread the sheets in long rows while others hammered them into place. This process turned raw ground into a usable runway in a fraction of the time it would have taken with traditional methods. PSP was not perfect. It could be slippery in rain and would bend under repeated stress. But in war, speed mattered more than comfort. The actual work followed a set order, refined through many previous landings. As soon as the Marines pushed back the first defensive line, the Seabees moved in. They started by clearing the area of wreckage, trees, and any remaining mines. Bulldozers pushed debris into piles for later removal or simply shoved it out of the way. At the same time, survey teams marked out the exact layout of the runway using flags and rope. This step ensured that the final airstrip would be straight, level, and long enough for the planes assigned to use it. Once the clearing was done, leveling began. Many of the islands were made of coral or volcanic rock, which was both a challenge and a resource. Bulldozers dug into high ground and pushed the material into low areas, creating a relatively flat base. In some places, the coral was crushed and used as fill, adding strength to the runway foundation. Graders followed behind, smoothing the surface and shaping it to drain rainwater quickly. This was vital because tropical storms were common, and standing water would ruin a landing strip. With the ground prepared, teams began laying down the PSP. Crews worked side by side, each responsible for a specific section. Men at the front carried sheets from supply trucks, dropping them into position. Others locked the planks together with specialized tools. Behind them, a final group checked for gaps or loose panels and secured everything with stakes. At the same time, another team erected temporary control towers, radio shacks, and fuel depots so the airfield could begin operations as soon as the runway was complete. The entire effort took place under constant threat. Japanese artillery targeted the construction site whenever they could. Snipers fired from hidden positions. Enemy aircraft launched bombing runs at night, hoping to destroy machines and supplies. The Seabees worked through it all, relying on Marine and Navy gunfire to keep most of the enemy at bay. Casualties were inevitable, but work never stopped. If a man fell, someone else stepped forward to take his place. What made it possible to finish in just 24 hours was not only the equipment or the materials, but the planning behind them. Before the battle even began, every detail had been worked out. Supplies were staged on transport ships in the exact order they would be needed. Bulldozers were positioned near the ramp of their landing craft, ready to move the second the door dropped. Fuel drums were stored near generators so that power could be established quickly. Even the layout of the work teams was rehearsed in advance, with each man knowing his task and the order in which he would perform it. The Seabees divided their labor the way a military unit divides a battlefield. Some crews focused on heavy construction, while others handled logistics, maintenance, and defense. This allowed work to continue without interruption. If a machine broke down, mechanics were on hand to repair it immediately. If an ammunition cache was found during clearing, a demolition crew neutralized it without slowing the rest of the operation. By working in parallel instead of in sequence, they saved precious hours. The coordination between engineers, Marines, and supply officers was equally important. While the Seabees built the airfield, combat units guarded the perimeter and supply teams moved food, water, and spare parts to the front lines. Radios kept everyone in contact so problems could be reported and solved quickly. In many ways, the construction site functioned like a battlefield. The difference was that instead of capturing ground, the Seabees were building a weapon, a runway that would allow aircraft to take off and strike the enemy directly. By the time the first planes landed, the system was already proving itself. The Japanese never expected an airstrip to appear overnight. Their plans were based on the assumption that they would have days or even weeks to disrupt construction. Instead, they woke to find American fighters and bombers operating from what had been their territory only hours earlier. This speed was not an accident. It was the result of a process designed for war, executed with precision under fire. The Seabees came ashore only hours after the first wave of Marines landed. Smoke from burning palm groves drifted across the beach. The ground shook from artillery fire. Machine guns rattled in short bursts. There was no quiet moment to begin work. From the first step onto the sand, every move was made under fire. Marines fought to push the Japanese defenders back from the shoreline. Their goal was to create a thin perimeter where engineers could begin construction. Even before the area was fully secure, the Seabees unloaded bulldozers, graders, and crates of pierced steel planking. They knew the Japanese would not give them time to work in safety. The only way to succeed was to start immediately. As the bulldozers roared to life, Japanese artillery zeroed in on the noise and movement. Shells slammed into the ground near the worksite, throwing dirt and coral into the air. Men dove for cover, then jumped up and kept working. Snipers fired from hidden positions in the treeline. Marines tried to spot the flashes and take them out, but the jungle was thick and visibility was poor. Every time a Seabee climbed onto a bulldozer or crane, he knew he was a target. The enemy's goal was clear: destroy the runway before it could be finished. They launched repeated counterattacks throughout the day. Small groups of Japanese soldiers slipped through the lines, trying to reach the construction zone. Marines fought them off at close range, sometimes only yards from where the Seabees worked. At night, Japanese aircraft swooped in to drop bombs on the site, forcing men to halt work briefly and take cover. Once the danger passed, they returned to their machines and continued under the light of flares and burning wreckage. Midway through the operation, a shell landed near one of the main bulldozers. The blast tore through the engine compartment and flipped the machine onto its side. It was one of only a few bulldozers on the island, and without it, progress would slow to a crawl. The loss came at a critical moment, with half the runway still incomplete. A group of Seabees ran to the damaged vehicle as rounds fell around them. They used steel cables and another bulldozer to right the wreck. Mechanics began repairs on the spot, working under fire with wrenches and welding gear. The men had no protective cover. They crouched behind the machine itself, using it as a shield while they replaced broken lines and hammered bent panels back into shape. Shrapnel sliced through the air. One mechanic was hit and carried to the rear, but the others kept working. Within an hour, the bulldozer roared back to life. The moment it moved forward again, cheers went up from nearby crews. The work could continue at full speed. While the Seabees fought their battle on the ground, another drama played out in the sky. American pilots circled offshore in fighters and bombers, waiting for the signal that the runway was ready. Their planes were low on fuel, and they could not stay airborne indefinitely. If the airstrip wasn't finished soon, some would have to ditch in the sea. Radios carried tense messages back and forth. Pilots asked for updates, and CB foremen gave rough estimates of how long it would take. The answer was always the same: keep circling, keep waiting. On the ground, the pressure was enormous. Every man knew that lives depended on their speed. Crews hauled steel planking by hand, laying it down in a continuous line. Others locked the panels into place and hammered stakes to secure them. Bulldozers smoothed the edges, clearing room for the next row. There was no pause, no time to rest. Even wounded men stayed close, offering what help they could. As the final sections of planking went down, enemy artillery fire grew heavier. It was clear the Japanese understood what was about to happen. The roar of incoming shells mixed with the pounding of hammers and the grinding of machinery. Marines tightened the defensive ring, firing into the jungle at any movement. At last, the runway reached the minimum length needed for landing. A signal flare shot into the sky. Offshore, the first flight of American fighters peeled away from their holding pattern and approached the island. The Seabees scrambled off the runway, clearing equipment and debris in seconds. Engines screamed overhead as the first plane touched down, its wheels clattering on the steel planks. A second and third followed immediately. The timing was almost perfect. The last of the construction crews were still moving to safety when bombs began to fall on Japanese positions inland. The fighters had barely refueled before launching their first strikes in direct support of the ground troops. For the Marines pinned down by enemy fire, the sound of friendly aircraft was a relief. They waved and shouted as the planes roared overhead. The Japanese were stunned by what they saw. Only a day earlier, they had controlled the area completely. Now, American aircraft were operating from a fully functional base within sight of their positions. Their artillery switched targets, trying desperately to damage the runway, but it was too late. Planes took off and landed in a continuous cycle, blasting enemy strongpoints and supply routes. On the ground, the Seabees finally paused. Some dropped where they stood, too exhausted to move. Others sat in small groups, watching the planes climb into the sky. Many had not slept or eaten in over 24 hours. Their hands were raw from handling steel and tools. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat and mud. But the airfield was complete, and that meant victory. The arrival of those first fighters changed the course of the battle immediately. Japanese counterattacks faltered under the weight of constant bombing. Supply lines were severed. The defenders, who had been confident only hours earlier, now faced the full power of American air support right on their doorstep. The Seabees had built more than a runway. They had built a lifeline for the men fighting on the island and a weapon that turned the tide of the campaign. When the first American fighter rolled to a stop on the new runway, a shout went up across the beachhead. Marines who had been pinned down by enemy fire for days raised their rifles and helmets into the air. Some waved their arms, others simply stood and watched, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. The sight of that plane meant more than just firepower. It meant relief. It meant survival. They knew that from this moment on, they would not fight alone. The fighters took off again within minutes, diving inland to strike Japanese positions that had been pouring shells onto the beaches. The change was immediate. Enemy artillery went silent one gun at a time. Marines pointed to the sky as bombs struck targets they could not reach on foot. For the infantrymen, it felt like the tide of battle had shifted in front of their eyes. A corporal later recalled how men around him began to smile and laugh for the first time in days. even as they dug new foxholes and prepared for another night of fighting. For the Seabees, there was no cheering at first. When the last section of steel planking was laid and the first planes came in, most of them were too exhausted to react. Many simply dropped where they stood, sitting on piles of tools or lying flat on the hot steel mats. Their hands were cut and swollen from handling the heavy panels. Faces were smeared with mud, oil, and dried blood. Some still carried fresh bandages under their torn uniforms. One petty officer sat apart from the others, leaning against a fuel drum. He pulled a pencil stub from his pocket and began to write on a scrap of paper. His words were plain and to the point. He described the last 24 hours as a blur of smoke and noise. He wrote about the bulldozer that had been knocked out by shellfire and how the crew had fixed it under fire. He mentioned the moment when the first plane landed and how it felt to see it roll safely to a stop. "We were dead on our feet," he wrote, "but we got it done. The boys flying overhead can fight now because we built them a place to land." When he finished, he folded the paper and tucked it inside his shirt. He planned to mail it home when he got the chance, though he knew it might be weeks before that happened. For now, it was enough just to get the words down. Elsewhere on the island, the reaction was very different. Japanese scouts crept through the jungle at dawn, sent to report on the progress of the Americans. They returned pale and shaken. Their commander listened as they described what they had seen. The airstrip was not just partially built, it was complete. Fighters were taking off and landing in a steady rhythm. The noise of their engines echoed through the hills, a sound that carried a clear message. The Americans were now in control of the skies. The commander refused to believe it at first. He demanded details. The scouts repeated their report, their voices flat and subdued. When he finally accepted the truth, he slammed his fist against the map table. The defensive plan he had relied on was gone. His artillery positions, supply depots, and even his headquarters were now vulnerable to attack from above. In a dugout nearby, a young Japanese soldier sat in silence, writing in his small diary by the light of a flickering lamp. His words were simple. He wrote about the sounds of American planes flying overhead and the feeling of helplessness they brought. "Yesterday," he wrote, "we were certain we could hold this place. Today, the sky belongs to them. We have no cover. There is nowhere to hide." He paused, then added one final line. "The earth shakes when their bombs fall, and our hearts shake with it." As day turned to night, the contrast between the two sides grew sharper. On the American side, the new airfield became a hub of activity. Planes refueled and rearmed in a constant cycle. Marines rested in shallow foxholes, knowing they now had air cover day and night. The Seabees, though exhausted, began to plan improvements to the strip, expanding it to handle more aircraft. There was a sense of forward motion, of momentum building with every passing hour. On the Japanese side, morale crumbled. Soldiers who had fought fiercely the day before now moved cautiously, fearful of being spotted from above. Supply runners stopped traveling during daylight, forcing units to ration food and ammunition. Officers tried to rally their men, but many stared blankly at the ground or looked to the sky with dread. The psychological effect of the new airstrip was as powerful as the physical damage caused by bombs and strafing runs. Back at the edge of the runway, the Seabees watched another group of fighters lift off into the darkening sky. The roar of engines faded into the distance. One young builder turned to his crew chief and asked if they could finally sleep. The chief nodded, his expression tired but firm. "You earned it," he said. The men stretched out on the warm steel planking they had spent the last day installing, too weary to move any farther. In the distance, Marines continued to cheer each time they saw a plane return safely. The sound drifted across the battlefield, a mix of relief and determination. For those on the ground, it meant they could keep pushing inland. For the Seabees, it was proof that their work mattered. And for the Japanese, it was the sound of inevitability. When the first fighters lifted off from the new airstrip, the effect on the battle was immediate. Those planes carried bombs, rockets, and machine guns, and they went straight into action against Japanese strongpoints. The Marines fighting inland felt the difference within hours. Enemy artillery positions that had been pounding the beaches were destroyed one by one. Japanese troops moving through the jungle were spotted from above and cut down before they could launch counterattacks. For the first time since landing, American ground forces had steady and reliable air support. The ability to strike from the island itself changed everything. Before the airstrip was built, planes had to fly from distant carriers or bases hundreds of miles away. That limited how long they could stay over the target. It also meant fewer flights each day, giving Japanese defenders windows of time when they could move or regroup. With a runway in place, those gaps disappeared. Aircraft now launched directly from the island, staying overhead for hours, ready to respond the moment ground troops called for help. Japanese reinforcements found themselves cut off. Barges and small ships tried to slip through at night, bringing supplies and fresh troops to the front. Patrol planes and night fighters spotted them and called in strikes. Many never reached the shore. Without food, ammunition, or replacements, Japanese units on the island began to weaken. Their once strong defensive lines shrank under constant pressure. The destruction of Japanese supply lines was more than just a tactical victory. It forced the enemy to fight in isolation, each garrison cut off from the others. This was the essence of the American island-hopping strategy. Instead of taking every island in a straight line, the U.S. bypassed some and targeted key locations like Saipan and Tinian. These islands became forward bases from which the next attack could be launched. With an airstrip built in a single day, the transition from invasion to offensive operations was almost seamless. In earlier battles, weeks might pass between capturing an island and using it as a base. During that time, the enemy could regroup, reinforce nearby islands, or even counterattack. By removing that delay, the Seabees gave U.S. forces a new kind of speed. It was not just about moving fast, but about denying the enemy any time to recover. The Japanese never had a chance to adjust to this pace. As the campaign moved forward, the value of this rapid construction became clear. From Saipan, American bombers could now reach the Japanese home islands. Missions that were once out of range became possible almost overnight. The first bombing raids over Japan began only weeks after the island was secured. This leap in range shocked Japanese commanders, who had expected to hold a buffer zone far longer. For the troops on the ground, the presence of nearby air power meant fewer casualties. In earlier battles like Tarawa, Marines had suffered heavy losses because air support was limited and distant. On Saipan, close coordination between pilots and ground units saved lives. When a unit was pinned down, a quick radio call could bring a fighter overhead within minutes. Targets were destroyed with precision, allowing the Marines to advance with fewer men lost. The psychological effect was just as important as the physical results. American troops knew that help was always near. The sound of friendly aircraft overhead gave them confidence to push forward. Japanese soldiers, on the other hand, lived in constant fear. They could no longer move during daylight without being spotted. Even at night, patrols risked detection by flares or radar. Every movement carried the threat of sudden attack from above. Japanese strategy had been built on the belief that the natural defenses of the islands, the jungles, cliffs, reefs, and caves, would slow any attacker. They counted on making the Americans pay for every foot of ground. Even if they lost an island, they expected the delay to give them time to prepare for the next battle. This plan collapsed when the Americans proved they could turn a captured beachhead into a fully operational base almost instantly. The speed of the Seabees' work stripped away the advantage of terrain. No matter how strong the defenses, once the airstrip was in place, Japanese positions were doomed. Bombers destroyed fortifications that infantry alone could not breach. Fighters patrolled constantly, making movement impossible. Every defensive tactic relied on buying time, and the Seabees erased that time from the equation. Japanese commanders struggled to adapt. Some tried dispersing their forces to make them harder to target, but that weakened their ability to resist on the front lines. Others concentrated their troops in hidden positions, only to see them destroyed when American bombers dropped massive loads on suspected areas. Every adjustment came too late because the Americans moved faster than the Japanese could react. On the American side, the success fed directly into planning for future operations. commanders realized that with Seabee-built airstrips, they could advance at a pace no enemy could match. Each captured island became a launch point for the next attack. Supplies flowed forward smoothly, protected by nearby air cover. The momentum never stopped. At Saipan, the difference was visible within days. The first small strip built in 24 hours was quickly expanded. Larger runways appeared beside it, capable of handling heavy bombers like the B-29. Soon, entire air groups were operating from the island. From these runways, raids reached Japan itself, striking military factories and cities deep within the homeland. For Japanese soldiers still fighting in the caves and hills of Saipan, this was a crushing blow. They had been told that their sacrifices would slow the Americans and give their nation time to prepare. Instead, they saw American planes taking off from what had been their territory, attacking their homeland while they were still fighting for their lives on the front lines. The speed of construction did more than win a single battle. It shattered the Japanese belief that they could delay the inevitable. Natural obstacles no longer mattered. The ocean no longer offered protection. With each new airfield, the war moved closer to Japan, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. When the war ended and the guns fell silent, the stories of what had been accomplished in the Pacific began to spread. Among the many accounts, the tale of the 24-hour airstrip stood out. Men who had been there described it in simple terms. One day there was nothing but coral and jungle, and the next day fighter planes were taking off under their own power. It was not just another story of combat. It was a story of what could be built under impossible conditions. The Seabees returned home to a country that was ready to rebuild and grow. Many of them went back to their old trades, but they brought with them skills learned under fire. They knew how to organize men and machines for maximum speed. They knew how to improvise when parts were missing or plans fell apart. These abilities translated directly to peacetime needs. Some worked on highways and bridges, while others built factories, docks, and airports. The same methods that had built a runway in the middle of a battle were now used to create the infrastructure of a modern nation. The Navy recognized the value of what the Seabees had done and kept the units active after the war. Their role shifted, but the core mission remained. In Korea, Seabees built bases and roads under harsh winter conditions. In Vietnam, they cleared jungles, set up landing zones, and constructed airstrips in hostile territory, often under direct attack. Each conflict added new challenges and new techniques, but the foundation was the same as it had been in the Pacific. Speed, planning, and adaptability were always the priorities. Civilian agencies and foreign militaries also studied what the Seabees had achieved. Engineers from allied nations examined how equipment had been staged, how teams had been organized, and how runways had been laid so quickly. These lessons influenced not only military engineering but also disaster relief and emergency response. When an earthquake or flood destroyed roads and airports, rapid construction teams were deployed using methods first developed in World War II. Temporary runways built after hurricanes or tsunamis bear a direct link to those built under fire on Saipan and Tinian. The impact of the Seabees' work reached far beyond engineering circles. Their actions captured the public imagination. Newspapers during the war had reported on their feats, but in the post-war years, books and documentaries told the full story. Veterans gave interviews, describing in detail the constant shelling, the roar of bulldozers, and the moment when the first plane touched down. These accounts were often understated, reflecting the plain-spoken nature of the men who had lived through them. Hollywood also took notice. War films of the 1950s and 1960s featured scenes inspired by the Seabees' experiences, sometimes directly showing the building of airstrips, other times using it as background for larger narratives. While not always accurate, these films kept the memory alive for a generation that had not witnessed the war firsthand. They also reinforced the idea that building could be as heroic as fighting. In museums and memorials, the Seabees hold a special place. At naval bases and veterans' halls, sections of pierced steel planking are displayed alongside photographs of the men who laid them. Maps trace the path of the island-hopping campaign, showing how each airfield became a stepping stone toward Japan. Visitors can see the tools and machines that were used and understand the scale of what was accomplished in so little time. On some Pacific islands, The remnants of those wartime runways still exist. Overgrown with grass and trees, they are quiet reminders of the furious activity that once took place there. In a few locations, memorial markers stand where men worked and died. Veterans and their families visit these sites, reflecting on what was achieved and the cost at which it came. These visits are often private and solemn, but they speak to a bond that stretches across decades. The Seabees motto, "We build, we fight," sums up their unique role. They were trained to defend themselves, but their true mission was creation. During the war, that creation was measured in feet of runway and tons of material moved. Each success gave American forces the ability to move forward. Their work showed that victory depended not only on defeating the enemy in battle, but also on shaping the battlefield to meet your own needs. This idea influenced military strategy long after the war ended. Modern planners view construction as an essential part of any campaign. Bases, airfields, and supply routes are included in initial plans rather than added later. Rapid deployment units are equipped with modular runways and portable shelters, all designed to be assembled quickly in hostile environments. The techniques have evolved, but the guiding principles remain the same as they were in 1944. Beyond military applications, the story of the 24-hour airstrip has entered cultural memory. Writers use it to illustrate the importance of preparation and adaptability. Historians cite it as proof of how logistics can determine the outcome of a war. Even in business and industry, the example is sometimes invoked to show how coordinated effort can achieve the seemingly impossible. Personal stories keep the history grounded. Letters written by Seabees during the campaign still exist, preserved by families and museums. One describes the exhaustion of working through the night while shells burst nearby. Another simply states, "We built it so our boys could land and fight." These voices remind readers that the achievement was not just a technical feat but a human one. Japanese accounts also survive, offering a different perspective. Diaries recovered after the battle described the shock of seeing a fully operational airstrip appear where none had been before. One entry reads, "Yesterday this was ours. Today their planes rise from it, and we have no answer." These words capture the psychological impact as clearly as any photograph. The legacy of the Seabees is seen today whenever a disaster zone is reached by emergency teams bringing in portable runways, water systems, and shelters. It is seen in military exercises where rapid construction is part of the plan, and it is seen in the quiet pride of veterans who know that their work helped shape the modern world. Wars are often remembered for battles and victories, for generals and strategies. But behind every success are the builders who made it possible. The story of the 24-hour airstrip reminds us that speed and adaptability can be as decisive as strength of arms. It shows that the ability to create under pressure is itself a form of power, one that can change the course of history.